The gavel was wood, old, dark and heavy. It made a sound like a dead tree falling a long way off. A sound of finality. The man from the bank, the one in the polished suit, smiled a clean, white smile that didn't involve his eyes. His name was Davies. He adjusted the knot of his tie. Thank you all for coming. On behalf of Sterling Mutual Bank, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Thorne on his acquisition of parcel 22A, the old coal farm. Mr. Thorne, a developer with soft hands and a hard face, gave a slight nod. He was already looking at his phone, no doubt calculating lumber costs and lot lines for the houses that would soon replace the 88 acres of fallow fields. The room was small, an annex at the county courthouse. It smelled of damp wool coats and weak coffee. About 15 people sat on metal folding chairs. Some were neighbours, their faces grim, watching a piece of their town get carved up and sold to a man from the city. Others were speculators, their eyes restless, already regretting they hadn't bid another 1,000. The auction was over. The farm was gone. A foreclosure on an $11,000 home equity loan, a debt that had festered after Frank Cole died and his widow Elsbeth fell behind. Davies was gathering his papers into a leather briefcase, a smooth, practiced motion. The proceedings are concluded, he said. The title transfer will be recorded by end of day. That sale isn't valid. The voice was quiet, not loud, not angry, just clear. It came from the back of the room near the door. Every head turned. Davies paused, his hand hovering over the clasp of his briefcase. He looked up, his professional smile faltering for a fraction of a second. An old woman was standing. She wore a plain cloth coat, the kind that lasts for 30 years. Her hair was grey and tied back neatly. Her hands, clasped in front of her, were weathered from work they hadn't done in some time. In one hand, she held a long, yellowed envelope. It was Elsbeth Cole. She looked directly at Davies, not at the developer, not at the auctioneer, at the man from the bank. I'm sorry, Davies said, his voice recovering its smooth, patronizing tone. Mrs. Cole, I understand this is a difficult day, but the legal process is complete. He tried to close his briefcase. You failed to notify the senior lien holder, Elsbeth said. Her voice didn't waver. It was as flat and solid as the land she was talking about. Davies let out a short, controlled sigh. It was the sound of a patient man dealing with an unavoidable emotional inconvenience. He left his briefcase open and walked around the table, stopping a few feet from Elsbeth. His posture was meant to be reassuring, the kind a doctor uses before delivering bad news. Mrs. Cole, he began, his voice lowered. Our title search was exhaustive. Sterling Mutual held the only lien against the property, the mortgage you and your husband took out in 2008.
There are no other liens. Not on our records. Not on the county's records. We checked everything. He gestured to the room, to the official setting, as if the walls themselves proved his point. The people on the folding chairs watched. They didn't move. A phone was quietly set down on a lap. A man in a flannel shirt shifted his weight, the chair legs scraping against the linoleum. They were a silent chorus. They had seen Elsbeth and her husband work that land for 50 years. They had seen the bank's foreclosure sign go up on the fence 6 months ago. They were here to witness the end. Now, something else was happening. Elsbeth didn't respond to his explanation. She didn't argue about title searches or county records. She simply looked at the yellowed envelope in her hand, then back at him. She took 3 slow steps forward. The room was quiet enough to hear the soft scuff of her work boots on the floor. They were old boots, clean but permanently stained with the dust of the fields.
Dust on her cuffs. She reached the table where Davies had been standing and placed the envelope on its polished surface. It lay there between the bank's pristine white folders and the developer's glossy prospectus, a relic from another time. The paper was brittle at the edges. The front had a single line written in her late husband's careful, blocky handwriting. Pond Lien, paid 1975. Davies looked at the envelope. He did not reach for it. He looked at her. Mrs. Cole, what is this? He was trying to keep control. He was the man from the bank. He was the one with the law and the procedures on his side. This was his room. He had run these proceedings 100 times. They always ended the same way. This is a 1973 mechanics lien, Elsbeth said, from the Tri-County Agricultural Cooperative for the irrigation pond. The words were simple, declarative. She was not making a case. She was stating a fact that had existed long before anyone else in the room was paying attention. Davies smiled again, this time with a touch of pity. Ma'am, a 50-year-old lien from a defunct cooperative would have been cleared. If it was ever valid, it was satisfied decades ago. It means nothing. He was wrong. To understand why he was wrong, you have to go back, not just to 1973, but to the weeks before the auction. 3 weeks earlier, Elsbeth Cole was in the attic. It was a cold morning. The house was quiet. Too quiet, since Frank was gone. She was packing his things, not throwing them away, just organizing. Frank was an organizer. He kept everything, not out of sentiment, but out of a belief that the past was a series of facts, and it was a man's duty to keep the records straight. He had boxes, a box for tractor manuals, a box for seed receipts going back to the Johnson administration, and a shoebox labelled House and Land. Inside, beneath the deed from 1968 and old property tax statements, was the yellowed envelope. She had seen it before, years ago, but had never thought much of it. Now she sat on the dusty floor of the attic and slid the contents out. There were 2 documents inside. The first was the lien itself. It was a carbon copy, the purple ink faded but still legible. It was filed with the county on May 12, 1973. It specified a debt of $4,000 owed to the Tri-County Ag Co-op for the excavation of an irrigation pond on parcel 7B of the Cole farm. It was signed by Frank Cole as the debtor and a man named Howard Sterling, no relation to the bank, as the co-op manager. The second paper was a simple receipt from the co-op dated 2 years later in 1975. It showed a final payment of $212. At the bottom, in red ink, was a stamp, paid in full. Frank had stapled the receipt to the Lien document, a single, rusty staple. Elsbeth sat there for a long time, the papers resting on her lap. The attic was cold, but she didn't seem to notice. She thought about that pond. The drought of 73 had been brutal, the worst in a generation. Frank had watched his corn wither. He said, "We can't be at the mercy of the sky." So he got the loan from the co-op, a group of farmers who pooled their resources. Not a bank, a cooperative. They hired a man with a bulldozer, and for a week the air was filled with the smell of diesel and upturned earth. The pond filled that winter and had never gone dry since. It had saved the farm more than once. She carried the box downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. She made coffee. She sat with that piece of paper all day, reading it over and over. It was more than just a record of a debt. It was a record of a time when neighbours helped neighbours, when a man's word was his bond, and when you kept your papers straight, just in case. She didn't know what it meant legally, not yet, but she knew what it meant to Frank. It meant a promise made and a promise kept. Frank Cole had been a quiet man. The kind of quiet that comes from listening more than speaking. He listened to the weather, to the sound of his tractor's engine, to the rustle of corn in the August heat. He believed in fences. Good fences make good neighbours, he'd say. But he also believed that a fence was just a suggestion. The real boundaries were ones of respect and honesty. He had inherited the 88 acres from his father, who had cleared the land himself in the 1930s. To Frank, the land wasn't a commodity.
It was a trust. You don't own the land, his father told him. You just hold it for your children. His rule about debt was simple. Never owe a man what you can't pay him tomorrow. But banks were different. A bank doesn't have a face, he'd say. It has rules. And rules can be bent by men who don't know the difference between paper and dirt. That's why he went to the co-op in 1973. The co-op was made of men he knew, men who understood what a drought could do to a family. The lien wasn't against the whole farm. Frank would never have agreed to that. It was specific, a lien against the 2 acres where the pond was dug, parcel 7B, and a 12-foot easement for access. A specific debt for a specific asset. He paid it off in 2 years, ahead of schedule. He drove into town, handed Howard Sterling the last check, and got the stamped receipt. Howard had offered to file the release of lien at the courthouse for him. Frank, ever meticulous, said he'd take care of it himself. But he never did. The harvest came in strong that fall. His son broke his arm playing baseball, and the paperwork got put in the shoebox. He had the proof of payment. For him, that was enough. The fact was settled. The co-op itself dissolved in the late 1980s. A couple of bad years, a few members retiring. Its assets were sold off. Some were bought by a regional bank, which was then acquired in the 90s by a larger one, which eventually merged into the conglomerate that was now Sterling Mutual. But the co-op's old debts, the ones that had been paid but not officially cleared from the county books, were never part of those sales. They were ghosts in the machine, unclaimed, unattached assets of a defunct entity. They simply sat in the county clerk's dusty archives, forgotten by everyone. Everyone, except Frank Cole's shoebox. The $11,000 debt that led to the foreclosure was different. It was from 2008. The roof needed replacing, and Elsbeth's medical bills were piling up. Frank had hated taking that loan. He signed the papers at the same kitchen table, his jaw tight. He told Elsbeth, "We watch them. They deal in paper. We deal in dirt. Never forget what's real." He died 3 years ago. The debt remained. Elsbeth tried to keep up, but her small pension wasn't enough. The letters from Sterling Mutual started coming, first polite, then firm, then threatening. They saw 88 acres of collateral. They saw a number on a spreadsheet. They never once saw the pond. Back in the courthouse annex, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Mr. Davies stared at the envelope on the table. He hadn't touched it. He was a man who dealt in the clean, unambiguous present. His world was made of fresh ink on new contracts. This yellowed paper was an intruder, a contamination from a past he had already dismissed. He looked at Elsbeth Cole, and for the first time, his professional calm seemed to crack, a tiny fissure. "Mrs. Cole," he said, his voice tight, "I'm sure this is very important to you, a memory of your husband. But in the eyes of the law, an unrecorded satisfied debt is a non-entity. It has no bearing on this proceeding." This was his first argument, the appeal to procedure. The rules were the rules. The paperwork had been filed. The gavel had fallen. He spoke with the unshakable confidence of an institution that believes its records are the only reality that matters. Elsbeth didn't argue. She didn't need to. She just stood there, her hands calm at her sides. A silence was more powerful than any objection. It created a vacuum in the room, and Davies rushed to fill it. He turned to the developer, Mr. Thorne, with a reassuring gesture. "This is a minor clerical issue, a piece of historical trivia. It changes nothing." Thorne didn't look reassured. He looked at Elsbeth, then at the envelope. He was a man who understood risk. An unexpected piece of paper was a risk. Elsbeth finally spoke. A voice cut through Davies's reassurances. "You said your title search was exhaustive." Davies's head snapped back toward her. "It was,
We use the best firm in the state." "Then they missed it," she said. A simple statement. Davies took a breath. He decided to open the envelope. He did it with a flick of his manicured thumbnail, a gesture of dismissal. He slid the two folded papers out. He read the lien first. His eyes scanned the legal language. He saw the date, 1973. He saw the amount, $4,000. He saw the name of the defunct co-op. His expression relaxed. He almost smiled. This was what he expected, an irrelevance. Then he read the second paper, the receipt. He saw the red "paid in full" stamp. "This proves my point," he said, looking around the room as if he'd just won a debate. "The debt was paid. It's a moot point. It's a ghost." This was his second argument, the appeal to logic. A paid debt cannot be a claim. He was about to fold the papers and hand them back to her, a kind, final gesture. But Elsbeth spoke again. "You didn't notify the lien holder." Davies froze. He looked at her as if she was speaking another language. "The lien holder is a cooperative that hasn't existed for 40 years. Who would we notify?" This was his third argument, an appeal to practicality. The world had moved on. The entities involved were gone. "You are required to show due diligence in locating them or their successors." She wasn't quoting law, she was quoting a conversation she'd had 2 days earlier.
A conversation with a retired property lawyer named George Finney. She had paid him for an hour of his time with 2 freshly baked apple pies. He had sat at his own kitchen table, much like hers, and reviewed the documents. He explained that a specific senior lien, even for a small amount, held a powerful position, especially if the lien holder was defunct and had no clear successor. The bank's foreclosure process required them to notify all lien holders, senior or junior. If they failed to do so, their entire process could be challenged. Sterling Mutual's title search had been lazy. They searched for active liens held by existing financial institutions. They never sent a junior clerk to the courthouse basement to pull the physical deed jackets from the 1970s. They relied on a digitised system that was incomplete, full of holes from a time before computers. They had assumed the past was gone. Davies was still trying to process her words.
He looked at the paper again, as if the answer was hidden in the faded purple ink. He was a creature of the digital age. He understood databases and electronic filings. This piece of 50-year-old carbon paper was an artifact from a dead world, a world with different rules. The developer Thorne spoke for the first time. His voice was sharp. "Is she right? Is there a cloud on the title?" Davies shot him a look that said, "Let me handle this." He turned back to Elsbeth, his voice losing all its prior warmth. "Mrs. Cole, this is a procedural obstruction. The bank will not be intimidated by this. We will file a quiet title action and have this frivolous claim expunged. It will cost you money you don't have." He was threatening her now. It was a mistake. She didn't flinch. "You can't file a quiet title action after the foreclosure sale is complete. You should have done that before the auction. You sold a property with an unclean title. The sale is invalid." The room went quiet. Not just quiet. The air itself seemed to go still. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was suddenly audible. Everyone in the room, the neighbours, the speculators, the developer, the bank lawyer, understood. This wasn't about an old woman's grief anymore. This was about a fatal procedural error, the kind of mistake that unravels everything. All eyes turned to the one person in the room who might know for sure. Martha Riley, the county clerk, had been sitting in the back row, observing the auction as was her duty. She was a woman in her late 60s with glasses perched on the end of her nose. She had worked in the county courthouse since she was 19. She knew the records, not just the digital ones, but the old ones, the ones in bound leather volumes in the basement archives. She knew their smell, the feel of the paper. Davies, seeing a potential lifeline, turned to her. Martha, can you please explain to Mrs. Cole how these minor historical discrepancies are typically handled? He was trying to frame it as routine, to enlist Martha as an ally of the institution. Martha did not answer him directly. She stood up slowly, her knees cracking softly. She walked to the front table. She didn't look at Davies. She looked at the two pieces of paper in his hand. May I? She asked. Her voice was soft. Davies, flustered, handed them to her. Martha held the Lien up to the light, adjusting her glasses. She ran a thumb over the raised, embossed seal of the county court from 1973, a seal she recognized. The press that made it had been retired 20 years ago, but she knew its distinct edge. She looked at Elsbeth. Frank Cole always was a stickler for details, she said, a small smile touching her lips. She then looked at the official plat map of the county that was pinned to a corkboard on the wall. She walked over to it. A finger, gnarled with arthritis but steady, traced the boundaries of the Cole farm. Then she tapped a small shaded area near the creek.
Parcel 7B, she murmured, the pond. She turned back to the room. Her gaze was calm and steady. She wasn't a lawyer or a judge, but she was the keeper of the record. In this room, her word held a different kind of authority. The bank's mortgage from 2008 is a general lien against the entire 88 acres, she said, speaking to the room at large. This document from 1973 is a specific prior lien against a 2-acre subparcel. Under state law, a prior lien takes seniority. It must be satisfied before or during the foreclosure process of any junior lien, and the lien holder must be notified. Her statement hung in the air. It was a simple, elegant confirmation of everything Elsbeth had said. Davies stepped forward. But the lien holder is defunct, Martha. It's a legal impossibility. Martha looked at him over the top of her glasses. That may be, Mr. Davies, but impossibility does not erase seniority. The law is very clear on the order of operations.
The responsibility was on the foreclosing party to resolve the senior claim before bringing the property to auction. Failure to do so creates a defect in the title. She folded the old papers carefully and handed them back to Elsbeth. A quiet gesture of transfer. The truth had been verified, not by the protagonist, but by the neutral party. The quiet competence of the clerk had broken the deadlock. Davies stood stunned. His face, usually a mask of professional confidence, was now pale. The structure of his world, built on the infallibility of his bank's procedures, had collapsed. He was in freefall. He looked at the developer, Thorne, whose face was now a thundercloud. Thorne was already pulling out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen, no doubt texting his own attorney. The other bidders were whispering amongst themselves. The neighbours in the back just watched, their expressions unreadable. Davies turned back to Elsbeth. It was a pivot, a desperate attempt to regain control, not of the room, but of the outcome. His tone shifted from aggressive to conciliatory. It was slick and sudden. Okay, Mrs. Cole, let's be reasonable. He walked toward her, his hands spread in a gesture of peace. Clearly there was a small oversight, a technicality. We want to make it right. The bank will satisfy this lien right now. He pulled a checkbook from his briefcase. What was the amount? $4,000? Let's call it 5, for your trouble. He was trying to reduce the entire situation to a simple transaction, a problem that money could solve. He still didn't understand. Elsbeth looked at the checkbook in his hand. She did not look at him. She said nothing. He tried again, his voice a little higher. 10,000. We'll pay you $10,000 in cash right now to release this claim. We can have the paperwork drawn up in an hour. He was treating her like a common creditor, assuming her motive was financial, that she was holding up the sale for a payday. This was the institution's final, flawed assumption, that every problem has a price. No, Elsbeth said.
Just the one word. It was not a negotiating tactic, it was a full stop. Davies was incredulous. 20,000, he said, the offer exploding out of him. It's an absurd amount for a forgotten debt. But the bank is willing to be generous to resolve this matter and be fair to Mr. Thorne. He gestured at the developer. Elsbeth finally looked at him. Her eyes were clear. It's not about the money. It's about the title. Your bank failed to follow the law. You sold something that you did not have the clear right to sell. Therefore, the sale that just took place is void. The retired lawyer, Mr. Finney, had been very clear on this point. This wasn't a claim to be paid off. It was a flaw in the chain of title that invalidated the entire proceeding. The auction itself was a legal fiction. Davies stared at her, his mouth slightly open.
He had no more arguments.
He had tried procedure, logic, and practicality. He had tried intimidation and bribery. Every tool in his expensive leather briefcase had failed. He was left with nothing but the quiet, immovable fact of the 50-year-old paper in her hand. A paper that remembered more than his bank's computers ever could. A heavy silence descended on the room. It was the silence of a machine that has been shut off. The gears of the auction, of the foreclosure, of the entire institutional process had ground to a halt. The developer, Mr. Thorne, ended his phone call. He walked with brisk, angry steps to the front table. He didn't look at Davies. He spoke to the auctioneer. "I am formally withdrawing my bid," he announced. "The seller has failed to provide a clean and marketable title. My deposit is to be returned in full by the end of business today." He then turned and looked at Elsbeth Cole. He gave her a short, sharp nod. It was not a nod of warmth, but of respect.
The respect of one professional recognizing the work of another.
Then he walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. His departure was a signal. The other speculators and bidders began to stir. They gathered their coats, their briefcases, their papers. There were quiet murmurs. Chairs scraped. Within a minute, the room was empty except for the officials, the neighbours, and Elsbeth, and Davies. The bank attorney stood alone at the front table. He looked down at his own pristine, useless documents, the successful bid sheet, the transfer forms. They were meaningless now. All the confidence had drained out of him. His shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had just aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He slowly, deliberately, reached up and unbuttoned his suit jacket, a gesture of surrender. He sank into one of the metal folding chairs. He put his head in his hands for a moment, then looked up at Elsbeth. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say.
The no-villain monologue rule was in full effect.
He did not explain, apologize, or curse. He simply sat in the wreckage of his own assumptions. Elsbeth Cole looked at him for a moment. There was no triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction, just a quiet stillness. She carefully took the two documents, the lien and the receipt, and folded them along their original worn creases. She slid them back into the yellowed envelope. She tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of her coat. She turned, gave a small, grateful nod to Martha the clerk, and walked toward the door. Her work was done. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't made a speech. She had simply brought a fact into a room that had forgotten it. The auction was over. The sale was undone, done. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the 88 acres. The light caught the surface of the pond, turning it to gold. Elsbeth Cole stood at the water's edge, her hand resting on an old wooden fence post, its surface smoothed by years of wind and rain. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and coming autumn. She heard footsteps on the grass behind her. It was her son, David. He was in his 40s, with Frank's quiet eyes and her steady hands. He came and stood beside her, looking out at the land. He had been in the back of the room at the courthouse, watching. "What happens now, Mum?" he asked. His voice was low. Elsbeth didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the fields, on the tree line at the far end of the property. Now, she said, we pay the $11,000. We have 30 days, according to the notice. We'll find a way. The reversal of the sale didn't erase the original debt. It just reset the clock. It gave them a chance. David was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at the pond. He never told me he didn't clear that lien, he said. He told me, she answered. He just didn't use words. He put the paper in the box. He trusted someone would know what to do with it when the time came. Some men collect problems. He collected patience. Some things are planted for the next man. Frank planted this pond for the farm. He planted that piece of paper for us. A quiet vindication, not a victory, but a restoration, a crooked thing made straight. Patience is a strange crop. It grows in silence and is harvested decades later. Elsbeth Cole understood that. So does a retired postal worker in Ohio who saved every receipt he was ever given. His collection sits in 34 shoe boxes, but only one receipt matters. For a stamp bought in 1992. It's for a certified letter a powerful company claims was never sent. We'll see what holds.